Is Nathaniel Hackett going to be an upgrade over Mike LaFleur as Jets offensive coordinator? Is there any hope left for Zach Wilson? Is there a player the Jets would be better off giving a big contract to than Quinnen Williams? We'll discuss all this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, February 1st, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. Helps the podcast out and helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. So does giving this episode a big thumbs up if you are watching on YouTube. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Then this game's definitely for you. Just download the game. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. And our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDON, all caps in the game. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Each Wednesday we try to do a mailbag. And our first question is about the Jets' new offensive coordinator. John, do you think that Nathaniel Hackett or any of the other candidates that the Jets brought in to interview for offensive coordinator actually represent an upgrade from Mike LaFleur? And do you have any concerns about a coach being brought in immediately after being fired? Granted, in this case, Hackett is going from being a head coach to an offensive coordinator. Well, I guess this was the question that I had when the Jets decided to move on from LaFleur, because I think performance-wise, you could make a very compelling argument that Mike LaFleur, the firing of Mike LaFleur was justified. Or, they phrased it as a mutual parting of ways, which maybe it was, because Mike LaFleur ended up in a decent situation with the Rams working under Sean McVay. Seems like working as an offensive coach under Sean McVay, or even as a defensive coach in the case of Brandon Staley, is the fast track to becoming a head coach in this league. So LaFleur landed on his feet. Looking at the situation when the Jets moved on from LaFleur, though, there were a number of things that made this potentially an unattractive job to candidates. First of all, you got a coaching staff whose job could be on the line next year. Now, that's not necessarily a deal breaker, because a lot of coaches are going to come and say, well, you know what, I can fix things and we won't get fired and we'll do well. But to fix things, you need a quarterback. And the Jets could get a quarterback this offseason, but you're kind of taking a leap of faith, because right now you don't have a quarterback. And to make any offense work, you're going to need a quarterback. So, and you also have the elements of nobody really knows the role the owner played in getting rid of Mike LaFleur. There are all kinds of rumors, and we know the Jets do not have very good ownership. And to the extent things matter when you're picking a team as a coach, ownership quality does make a difference in many cases. Now, there are only 32 jobs in the world where you get to run an NFL offense. You get to run an offense at the highest level of football. So even an unattractive offensive coordinator position, you're going to be able to get a compelling candidate in here. In fact, the last time the Jets had an offensive coordinator opening and the job was as unattractive as it was this offseason was back in 2017, when they went out and made a pretty good hire in John Morton, a coach who came from the New Orleans Saints, who had worked under Sean Payton and Jim Harbaugh and did a good job his 1 year working as Jets offensive coordinator. So even though a job is relatively unattractive, that doesn't mean you're incapable of hiring a quality candidate. But it's a challenge, and I go back to what I said during the season. A lot of people may disagree with me. I don't really think LaFleur was the driving force behind the Jets' offensive struggles. Yes, there are certainly things you can complain about LaFleur over. And yes, there were some games he was not very good. In that Minnesota game, the red zone play calling was certainly shaky. So it's not to say LaFleur is blameless, but I think the proportion of blame that gets put on LaFleur, and this is true in general, I think, of just offensive coordinators, they tend to get too much blame when things go wrong. And they don't, unless you're like a Shanahan or a McVay or a Randy Reid, you typically don't get a ton of credit when things go right. So it's a very thankless job. There are many situations where there are many times where I wonder why anybody would ever want to be an offensive coordinator in the NFL. There have to be better ways. If you can get an offensive coordinator job in the NFL, you could probably get a high-paying job in another field. So I think it's a tough spot. I don't love this hire. I'm not going to lie about it. This was my least favorite candidate when the Jets hired him. And part of it's, he's one of the few coaches in the NFL who ran an offense worse than Mike LaFleur last year. So if Mike LaFleur wasn't good enough, well, why is Nathaniel Hackett good enough after running a worse offense? Now, you can make the argument that, well, some guys just aren't good head coaches, and part of Hackett's issue was that he just was not cut out to be a head coach in the league. That's fair, but I also have not been that impressed by his offensive coordinator record. I think he's been very underwhelming, and that goes back to Jacksonville, it goes back to Buffalo. Now, the one thing I've been saying through the whole process, though, I think the players the Jets bring in, especially at the quarterback position, it's going to make a bigger difference than the coordinator they hire, because he did have success 1 year in Jacksonville when the Jaguars were good. And it was a team that, in broad strokes at least, was built very similarly to the Jets, where they were a defensive-oriented team that had a strong run game. And you saw in Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers, listen, if you put a good team up there around Nathaniel Hackett, he's not necessarily bad enough that he's going to sink it. I just don't think he really brings a whole lot to the table. And I guess this was the challenge, because when you got rid of LaFleur, you were either going to bring in somebody who was completely untested, and a guy, there's a coach with the Eagles, Brian Johnson, who I think could have been a good fit, who was very intriguing in my mind. You could have found, it's conceivable you could have found the next bright offensive mind, or you were probably getting somebody who was kind of underwhelming, an underwhelming veteran coach. Darrell Bevell, who's been around the league, was originally considered the favorite. Then he kind of took his name out of the running, and the Jets end up with Nathaniel Hackett. So I guess that was part of my question when the Jets moved on from LaFleur, because I didn't really see how this ended in them upgrading, and it's possible they've downgraded. I mean, I don't think there's any guarantee Hackett's going to be as good as LaFleur. Now, maybe he's better. It's also possible he's better, but looking at this right now, it's very difficult for me to say that the Jets actually upgraded. Now, do I have a problem with the Jets hiring Hackett right after he leaves a head coaching job? Not a ton. I'd have a bigger issue in like a case like what happened back in 2019 with Adam Gase, where he failed as a head coach and then immediately got another head coaching job. Because one of my issues with the Gase hire, and there were many, this was not the only issue, but one of my issues was that I felt like Gase did not have any time to kind of get away from his failure in Miami and think about what he did wrong and think about what he'd do differently next time. And that I thought was an issue, because I think when you fail somewhere, you got to think about how you're going to handle it the next time you get a job, and think about why things did not go well. And part of the issue was that if you listened to Gase at the time, it sounded like he did not believe he actually failed in Miami, which was an issue. I think it's different when you're moving from a head coaching job back to a coordinator job, because Hackett's been a coordinator before. So say what you will about him, and I certainly will say a lot, I'm sure, in the months ahead, and I'm sure I certainly will once we get into the 2023 season. He's been a coordinator before, so if the Jets were hiring him for a head coaching job right now, I may say, well, geez, they just hired a guy who failed, and he hasn't had time to reflect on what went wrong. It's a little bit different. He's taking kind of a step back now. He's going back into a reduced role. It's not the same role he just failed at last year. And while I'm very skeptical of how much he had to do with the success of the Green Bay offense while he was there, I mean, the last time he was a coordinator, at least on paper, they were pretty successful. So I don't have a big issue from that in that respect. My issues are just, I don't know that they've upgraded, and I question how good Hackett really is. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about one of the quarterbacks Hackett may be working with. Is it worth it for the Jets to keep Zach Wilson? How much hope should fans have for Zach Wilson? We'll talk about all this and more as we continue this mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. It's your turn to compete now. You've heard me talk about this game app, and it's so much fun to play. But more on that later. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM, and have you dreamed of managing your football franchise? Well, your dream can come true, and this game's definitely for you if that's the case. You'll manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through seasons, and lead your team to glory trying to build a dynasty. With Ultimate Football GM, you're responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, and navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft and all the ups and downs of the season. And all this comes in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. And we've now created a Locked On League for you to compete against other Locked On fans all over the world. Can you be the ultimate Locked On Football GM? Choose the Locked On League in the app to join. Can you create a football dynasty? And Locked On Jets listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game store. Again, that's Locked On in all caps, so be sure to check it out today. And to download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Thanks again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. And you should also know that Locked On is heading to the Senior Bowl. Get inside analysis from the hosts that covered the NFL's next generation in college and find out which NFL draft boards these players will be climbing, all in one location. Subscribe to Locked On NFL Draft for nightly live shows from the Senior Bowl on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question. John, it seems inevitable that the Jets will bring in a veteran quarterback, and Zach Wilson seems like he's on the back burner, or maybe totally done in New York. If the Jets get Aaron Rodgers or Derek Carr, do you think it would still make sense to keep Wilson as a backup? Or would you feel like the locker room is totally out on Wilson and the Jets should move on this offseason? Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I necessarily know the answer of whether the locker room is totally out on Wilson. And to be honest with you, that would go a long way towards my decision making. You know, I think it's pretty clear the Jets are not going to enter the 2023 season with Zach Wilson as their starting quarterback. Part of the decision will be based on the salary cap situation, and I think, most of Wilson's money's been guaranteed. Most of the Jets are stuck with these cap hits no matter what happens for the most part. So I think that it makes sense to keep him around unless the locker room's just totally moved on from him, because in my view, you always want to invest at the quarterback position. And I think you should always have some young guy you're trying to develop on your team. The odds are always against the developmental quarterback figuring it out, but the rewards are so great that even though it's a low percentage event, it's such a high impact event that it's something you should look to do. And, rather than look across the league, rather than look across the college landscape, you already have this guy who's, I don't know how good he's going to be, but you did draft him second overall 2 years ago. So obviously you saw something then. Now, you may have been completely wrong. In fact, it seems like you probably were completely wrong. But if you're looking for a guy to develop, a guy who you think maybe you can nurture, maybe there's an outside chance he can work, well, he's already on your team. So you might as well try and work with him on the practice field and see maybe you could coach him up into becoming something. I mean, at this point, I think even if Zach Wilson became a credible backup quarterback, it probably would be better than the outcome you'd expect. So I think it's logical as long as the locker room is not totally turned on him, which we don't necessarily know, but it's tough to say. But I'd keep him. I'd keep him otherwise. Next question. Hi, John. In your opinion, what are the chances Zach Wilson becomes everything the Jets hoped he would be when they drafted him number 2 overall? I may be in the minority, but I still think Wilson has the athletic ability to be a legitimate franchise quarterback. He did show alarming signs this year, but I think a year or two of reset and he could be elite. What are your thoughts? I think anything can happen, and there are players whose careers trajectories have shocked me through the years. So one thing I've learned is never rule anything out, because players learn at different paces. Some players really struggle early on and it just clicks for them in one moment. I don't think it's going to... I mean, listen, I think the odds are against it happening for Zach. I don't think it's impossible for it to happen for Zach, but I think the odds are very much against it happening. And if Zach Wilson, turns it around, I don't know that he's going to be the elite player, because, maybe he's got athletic ability, but it's more than athletic ability at the quarterback position. And Zach is just lacking in so many fundamental areas. As much as you might be tempted to say it's only been 2 years, there are exceptions, but if you look through recent history in the NFL, typically you know whether somebody can play after year 2. Zach may be an outlier, but the other aspects, he's being a pretty extreme outlier because I think we have a tendency to view these things as either guys who panned out or busts, but there are degrees of busts. And I mean, Zach Wilson's really at the low end when we're talking about quarterback performance through his first 2 years. I mean, he's in the level of like a Joey Harrington or a Kyle Bowler, and you've probably seen some of the graphics that compare his numbers to Jamarcus Russell's. I mean, this is not just a bust. I mean, this is like one of those, at least through the first 2 years, it's been like one of those all-time bad situations. So you have to, when you think of it in that context, you also have to think about how far Zach needs to come. Because there's a difference being like 5 miles from a destination, and there's a difference being 10 miles from a destination. You may be far away in either case, but one of those you have much shorter path to get there. And Zach Wilson, I think, has as long of a path as any prospect in recent memory has had after 2 years. So it's going to take a lot of work. I just said it. I think that if you offered me right now, signing up for it right now, Zach Wilson's going to turn into a credible backup for your franchise, I would have to take it because I think if you just look at history, it's going to be very difficult for him. Next question is from Keith. John, my question is that since we need a veteran quarterback, would you contact the New Orleans Saints for Jameis Winston? He has a reasonable contract. I don't think it would take that much draft capital to get him. Either way, I see him as a better option than the other quarterbacks. He's much, much, much better than what we have now. I think of Winston as a fallback option. There are guys in professional sports, and the best way to describe them is they're always good enough that they're going to have a job somewhere, but they're never good enough to keep a job because their team gets them, and they don't perform well enough to keep. They always perform well enough that there's some team out there that says, this guy's an upgrade, we'll get him. But then, a year or two later, you're ready to move on from him. And, that's kind of how I view Jameis Winston. I mean, I don't think he's really an answer for the Jets. I think he's a guy who's a pretty good backup quarterback, but he's also had some injury troubles in recent years. He's a guy who's been pretty mistake prone through his career. I mean, I don't think he's on the level of a Derek Carr right now, and it's tough because there are so many options. But I think of him as more of a backup quarterback. I think of him along the lines of, maybe they're different types of players, but maybe along the lines of a Jacoby Brissett. I think he's better than the Gardner Minshew, but in the same ballpark. I think I understand the idea behind it because I do agree he'd be better than what the Jets have had in the past, but I don't think Jameis Winston's really the solution for the Jets at the quarterback position. I think if anything, he's a stopgap, and the ideal scenario right now for the Jets, I think, is finding somebody who could be like a medium-term option, somebody who buys you 3 to 5 years, who can stabilize the quarterback position and maybe give you a chance to find a guy in the draft over the next couple of years and bring him along slowly. I think that that's really what the focus has to be for the Jets. So, that's kind of my viewpoint. Next question, John. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Not sure why I chose this to finally ask you a question, but why has Teddy Bridgewater not been in the conversation yet? Why mortgage the future on Rodgers or Carr when you can continue to build a solid young team and get decent quarterback play for a few years? I've always been a big Teddy Bridgewater fan, but I think that injury changed his career. I mean, looking at his performance since the injury, I answer it the same way I'd answer the question with Jameis Winston. Although they're very different types of players stylistically, Bridgewater is a guy who really protects the football pretty well and doesn't make a lot of big plays for the most part. And Winston's the opposite. Winston's a playmaker, but the problem with him through his career has been you don't know whether the big play is coming for the offense or the defense. I think it's the same thing. I think Teddy's a good backup. I don't think Teddy's really a solution for your team going forward. And again, I think the Jets really need to look to find somebody who's going to be here for a couple of years this offseason and give you a chance to, buy time to find a solution through the draft. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out our weekly mailbag show. It's a foregone conclusion the Jets are going to re-sign Quinnen Williams, right? Well, we do have a question whether there might be a better player out there for the Jets to spend their money on, and I'll tell you who that player is as we continue this Wednesday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. This year, the only app you need at your Super Bowl party is FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book. And we're so excited to have FanDuel as our new sports betting partner at Locked On because they are the #1 sports book in America. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better because they have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet on Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/LockedOn to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. We are now into February. We're well past New Year's resolution season. Well, I hope you're keeping yours. And if your goal was to eat a little healthier this year, you got to try Built. With Built, healthy is actually tasty. They're so delicious that you'll think they're good for you because bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, and they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. It's tough to say how Built does it, but these bars taste like candy bars while maintaining amazing macros. And the bars are healthy. Most of them have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and only 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around for your box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built bars at Built.com. Well, now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right. Just head to your nearest Walmart today, walk into the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to Sam's Club, you can run in and grab a 13-bar box of one of their hit flavors, brownie batter or churro. You can thank me later, and of course, you can still order Built bars at Built.com. There's so many ways to get delicious Built bars. Try them. You'll love them. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on our Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question. Quinnen Williams is looking for the big money this offseason, but the Jets have a 10-man rotation, and with that, he's only on the field for about 70% of the snaps. Would the Jets be better off signing a guy like Jeremy Bates who plays 100% of the snaps? They would have a lockdown secondary with Bates. Well, I can't argue with the idea of signing Jeremy Bates. He'd be an excellent addition to the team. He's a very good player, and Jets certainly have a need at safety. I understand the argument about Quinnen Williams only being on the field 70% of the time and all the rotational stuff, but I think you also have to consider Quinnen Williams what Quinnen Williams gives you in those 70% of the snaps is better than almost any other defensive player gives you their time on the field. So you also have to consider impact. There are not a lot of big defensive tackle type guys, the 300-pounders, the interior types who play 90% of the snaps. There are a couple, but for the most part, guys are rotating in and out at that position. So you'd like to see Quinnen play maybe a little bit more, and I think the Jets kind of adjusted that at points during this season, but I still think you have to consider how dominant he was, because he still was a double-digit sack guy, despite the fact he was, missed some time near the end of the season, but also was kind of in a rotational role. So it didn't stop him from being a dominant player. It did not stop him from being a first-team All-Pro. And I think when we're talking defensive line, it's one of the most important spots on the field, and it's definitely an important spot in Robert Saleh's defense. So having a premier defensive lineman, even if he's going to come off the field, and part of the Jets team building is the Jets are going to play this way. They need to make sure they have plenty of quality depth on the defensive line. But I think that you pay Quinnen Williams. Quinnen Williams has shown that he's a great fit for your team. He's a great fit in the locker room. And listen, maybe he's not playing the whole game. But when he's in there, he's making as big of an impact. He's making a bigger impact in 70% of the snaps than a lot of guys are making in 100% of the snaps. And it's not that unusual. Safeties and linebackers and corners tend to not come off the field, whereas defensive linemen, even the great defensive linemen rotate out a little bit. Now, can the Jets play Quinnen a little bit more going forward? Yeah, I think that might be a good idea, but I don't think it's the type of thing that would prevent me from paying Quinnen Williams. And listen, I don't think the two necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. You can go out and get a good safety and still keep Quinnen around. And our last question: Woody is pushing to get Aaron Rodgers. If Joe Douglas gets him, how long do Jody and Saleh have to make a splash? Assuming no Super Bowl one and no Super Bowl appearance in 2023, how much time do they get to turn things around, and what gets them fired? Well, I think the expectations change, and the last time the Jets did this, it was 2008. They went out and got Brett Favre, and the coach got fired after the season because they had a bad stretch. They had a bad stretch run that year, and some people will say it was because Favre got hurt. I actually think that there's some things that have been lost in that season about the issues on the coaching staff. I think that's a story for another day. I think Woody's not going to be patient. Now, I'm not saying the Jets necessarily need to win the Super Bowl next year, but if you go make a move for Aaron Rodgers, I mean, that is like as win now of a win now move as you can get. That puts the Jets, and I've said this on past shows, every team there's a balance between building for, almost every team there's a balance between building for later and trying to win now. And at the extremes, there may be a team or two there's some team that's just completely starting over. They're completely hitting the reset button. They're trading off all their parts. And at the other extreme, there are teams that are just going for it now and they just don't care about the future. Trading for Aaron Rodgers will put the Jets into that latter category. And it's one of the reasons I don't think it's necessarily a great idea. I don't think Woody's going to be patient, though. I think if the Jets miss the playoffs next year with Aaron Rodgers, I think everybody's gone. That may be true no matter who the quarterback is, but I think it's going to lead to a less patient Woody rather than a more patient Woody. I think he's going to expect results immediately. I think it just brings the pressure up to another level for the coaching staff and the GM. I don't think it reduces it whatsoever. I think 2023 becomes a year where results need to happen immediately because you're trading for a 40-year-old quarterback. I don't know that you're really thinking about 3 years down the line. You're thinking about right here and now. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. Again, it helps the channel out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. So does giving this episode a big thumbs up on YouTube. If you're nostalgic, then thank you for watching YouTube. This is actually our first anniversary since we brought the show onto the video platform YouTube. So thanks for all your support in the last year. And I hope you have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.